hey there, gang. You guys said you wanted a long one. The patient is an early 70s Gibson J50. This is Norlin era Gibson. Not the most highly regarded time in their history, but there are always a few roses amongst the thorns, right? Unless you're in a bramble bush, there are no roses in there. Funny things going on. There was a big corporate enterprise that owned them. They also owned bowling alleys, which is probably where they got this pickguard material. It looks like something you'd find in a 70s bowling alley. Almost like a particularly bad piece of pepperoni. Anyway, this has seen a few rough spots along the road. There was a headstock break. Luckily, it was up in the head here, and it was a diagonal one with lots of surface area for glue, because it's holding just fine. The fretboard and frets are in reasonable condition. And there's the bridge. This thing has been cut way down. The leading edge here is a scant 1/8 of an inch, 3 millimeters. And it graduates up to about 3/16 on the back side, just around 4.5 millimeters. So basically half of the lowest reasonable height you would expect to find on a bridge. It's way low. And with that, this saddle has been cut down to nothing as well. This high E string here is just floating around on top of it with no break angle at all. Then there's the binding. This is all suffering from celluloid rot. There's this tortoiseshell celluloid. And where it's gone, there's a real Canadian classic here. This is hockey tape. It's even better than duct tape in some cases. So, celluloid rot. This is something that happens with this kind of plastic over time. When it's being made, there are plasticizers that are added to it that make it flexible, so it can go around the curves and stuff and just be a plastic. Over time, they can react to various atmospheric conditions, and there's some speculation as to exactly how this occurs, but they sort of revert to a liquid, or in some cases a gaseous state. The chemicals leach out and it crumbles and it shrinks and it gets sticky and really gross. It seems to happen faster and worse in the presence of certain other substances. Like I've heard vinyl is a catalyst for this. Or if they're kept in a really warm place in a case that is never opened, the fumes seem to build up inside there and it degrades to a greater extent. And there's really no cure for this once it gets going. You really can't do anything other than replace it, basically. I've heard of people doing things like immersing shrunken tuner buttons in super glue, thinking that might halt the process, but I'm not sure. I think that might be speculation. So we're going to try and take this off and install some new stuff. The owner thinks it's time for a neck reset. Looking at the action height, on the bass side, it's not bad. It's 6/64. Most people can play that. It's a little high on the treble. And of course, there's no adjustability left in this saddle. So I told him that doing a neck reset without changing this bridge would be just foolish. It's a waste of money. Because the sound, well, it sounds like cardboard. It somehow also sounds like tinfoil. It's quiet, and it's like it's missing big parts of the audio spectrum, as if someone had put a filter on it. It's weird. So we are going to make a new bridge, and if we're going to do that, we should do it before the neck reset, because it will give us something concrete to shoot towards with our angle, because we'll know where we need to end up. Looking at the relief on the neck, though, there's a lot of upbow here, in the range of 25 thousandths of an inch, more than 1/2 millimeter. So the first thing we have to do is see if the truss rod functions, because that could change the course of events. If the rod's broken, it's not worth it. We just hand it back. If we can adjust it to normal levels, it might bring down the action. And it also gives us some real-world conditions for figuring out how much set the neck actually needs. It's always a surprise. One screw is stripped out. Well, there is the end of a truss rod there. It's a good start. There's some adjustability. Okay, that brought us down to 14. Let's give another little twist here and see what happens. got a high fret. We're down around 10 thousandths relief. The action has come down to 5/64 and 4/64. Yeah, third fret's a bit up there, which we can look after. The pinchy Norlin era tuners too, they're very sharp on the corners. I should be using my new Ernie ball. See if I like this thing. I got it the other day. Yeah, it works okay. It's really smooth. This is not an endorsement. Let's have a quick look at the interior here. This is sort of classic Gibson double X brace, 60s, 70s style bracing. And it seems to have an LR Baggs Anthem style pickup. I don't know if it's real or not. It's got the under the saddle microphone there, and there's also a wire that goes up for an under saddle pickup. And just looking at this, it seems like there is one part of the X brace here has got a bit of a crack running up to the center joint, which will need some glue. The owner is not all that interested in keeping that pickup, so we can dispense with it. Try to take it out in one piece, obviously. Yeah, this is that familiar Yangshin pickup. I think this is the one I put in that Harmony refurb I did last spring. There's a pretty heavy deposit of glue along the front edge of this bridge, leading me to suspect it had come up at some point and been re-glued. Okay, while the bridge heater is warming up there, I managed to pull off a piece of the binding. I just want to get a measurement because it looks awful thick. Yeah, it's around 100 thousandths, 2.5 millimeters, which is, I think, wider than any commercially available tortoise binding you can get these days. If memory serves, StewMac has 90 thousandths, but they won't ship it to Canada. Actually, shipping it anywhere is kind of expensive because they have to tack on a pretty big hazmat fee. Celluloid is so flammable that major carriers, they don't want to risk shipping it around in case it bursts into flame. So the owner is okay with me putting anything on there. He says he could even have a ledge. He doesn't care as long as the broken stuff is gone. So I think we can use the 1/16 of an inch that I have. Maybe change the purfling scheme a bit and add a line or two to take up the extra space. Kind of a shame, but you know, that's what you run into with these old guitars. Bridge removal proceeds in its usual fashion. There's a pickguard crack that goes all the way up to the sound hole edge. Some glue in there and a cleat to hold things together. I'll start working on the bridge, planing an edge flat here. I'll mark the appropriate thickness with a marking gauge. It's going to be about 8.5 millimeters, 11/32 at its tallest point. And I'll transfer the outline from the previous bridge. I'll drill some bridge pin holes. Then I'll go outside and cut that outline to shape on the spindle sander. And I'll also take some time to arch the top surface of the bridge. It's not too arched. Gibsons tend to be a little bit flatter than some other guitars. After that, I'll scoop out the wings And here we have it all roughed in, ready for some sanding. It's possible to sand this too much. They weren't highly polished from the factory. If you look at the wings, you'll always see sanding scratches. You still will today, actually. This guitar is also close to 50 years old, so it shouldn't look like a brand new bridge. I'll check to make sure the bridge is in the right location, measure, and then scribe the outline. And then I'll take some time to scrape and sand all of the old glue and any lacquer that was underneath the bridge. Make sure it's a good clean surface for glue up. The area in front of the pinholes is pretty chewed up. This is one of those 70s Gibsons with a plywood bridge plate, so I'll patch these with some spruce, and later on I'll add a bridge plate overlay on the inside. Have a look at some of that rot. In this case it shatters like glass. Other times it gets kind of goopy. This is very sharp, but parts of it are also holding very tight to the channel it's in and the adjacent purfling lines. This is going to be a bit of a chore to get rid of. To make sure the underside of the bridge mates nicely with the top, I've cut a piece of self-adhesive sandpaper to the outline, and I'll use that to sand to show the high and low spots, and then alternate between scraping those away and sanding again until it's perfect. Okay, that's glued in place. I'm just cleaning up the excess and the squeeze out. Yeah, there's a little bit of purfling here that's cracked and separating from the wood of the top, and I kind of want to hold that down before I get into removing all of the bindings, so give this a day to cure. I'm just using Tight Bond to hold it in place. This is, I think, wood purfling, or it's that odd composite material. It's basically wood fiber, but like a fancy paper that they use for the black, white, black. So I'll tape that in place, and yes, I'm not using low tack tape for this. I need enough tack to hold it in place, and on a finish like this is sometimes risky, but I can usually heat this up. I'm going to heat up and remove the 15th fret here. Before trying to take this neck off, we should discuss Gibson's ability to throw surprises our way in a situation like this. Have a look at this area here on the heel and adjacent to it. You'll notice that there's dark brown lacquer sprayed on this area. You might see that and suspect that someone has come along and done this to disguise a repair. But in this era of Gibson, you can't discount the fact that this could be straight from the factory. Often they didn't get the cleanest looking edges to the heels. There'd be gaps and stuff, and they'd pack some filler in there and then just spray toner coats over top. It's the only place on the guitar they did this. If they'd done a bit more of a burst on the headstock too, it might have been more rational looking. So there's probably filler in there, and the heel is basically glued to the sides with it. And the other thing is that Gibson would put the necks on before finishing, which, one thing, it helps to that disguising process, but it's something Gibson have been doing for decades. It's just part of their procedure. So there's always a buildup of lacquer right in the corner, and we need to cut through that if we want to remove the neck. It's a very chippy finish at this stage. We're bound to lose some, but that's all in the game. And of course there can be surprises on the inside too. Lots of shims of varying materials, and not always the greatest fit between the dovetail tenon and the body. So they used a lot of sticky white glue in there, and it can be quite difficult to pull apart. So all this adds up to me saying removing Gibson necks can be a lot more unpredictable than Martin's. Certainly, and a lot of other guitars too. It's like cornflakes. I'm applying some heat to the extension using my sealing iron here. I'm going to try and remove this without taking off the pickguard on this one. It's a real gamble on these thin 70s guards, the celluloid guards, because as soon as you take them off, they start to shrink, and it can be astonishing just how fast that happens. You take it off, 2 days later you try to put it back on again, and there's exposed wood all the way around the outline, where it's shrunk like a 1/16 of an inch. And also they're stuck to the spruce of the top using a pretty tenacious adhesive. You know, sometimes they let go, but if they don't let go, you can damage the soundboard a lot trying to get them off again. So if we can do it without removing it, that's the way to go, I think. Plus, just finding this material, something that would look like this if I had to replace it, getting something that's long enough to do one of these big Gibson guards that has the correct look and the correct thickness. There was one guy on eBay, and then he went away, so I wouldn't know where to get it. Just want to let this happen in its own time. It's the main difficulty people run into that I've seen, is that they don't let the heat soak in long enough. They get ahead of themselves. I like to use 2 knives. It keeps part of the joint open. That's the thing with this white glue they were using here. It's really tacky. When it's hot, it's always very sticky. And when you take the heat away from it and let it contact, it can actually re-glue itself. So having the 2 knives keeps the joints separate. And the one that I'm not using is soaking up heat from above here, staying warm. So working towards that other side there. I mean, you got to be careful. I'm actually doing this in the less safe direction. The safest direction is actually this way, so that the edge of the knife blade is perpendicular to the grain lines. It's less likely to want to dig in and dive down into them that way. In this case, I can't really do that too easily. Just got to be careful. Keep the knife good and flat. Don't force it ahead of itself. Just, you know, wiggle a little bit and it'll come through on its own. Obviously, celluloid is not friends with heat. So, you know, try to strike a balance here where you're not putting the iron too close to the celluloid, otherwise it could start to curl up or potentially even burst into flame. Don't let that happen. You can see the tip of the knife blade is coming through on the other side here, all the way along. Oh, this glue is so sticky. Making up some resistance heaters here with the nichrome wire and high temperature sleeve. Trying something a little bit different this time. These are slightly wider stainless tubes. Actually, ordering the 1/16 of an inch stainless tubes from the USA was extremely expensive, so I managed to get a bundle of these at a fraction of the cost. I'm going to see if they'll work. Thing is, they're slightly wider than the ones we used last time. Rather than a 1/16 of an inch, these are about 80 thousandths, just under 2 millimeters, and actually they're slightly undersized, which is a good thing, because I want to put them into a 5/64 hole. So that should work. So they're going to be slightly bigger holes, but still small enough to be hidden by fret wire. If you judge this right, you end up hitting the airspace between the end of the dovetail and the front side of the pocket, although it's often filled with glue in these guitars. So I got this hooked up to the DC power supply. Okay, this has been going for some time now. It's a slower process than using steam, a little more relaxed though. The idea is to build up enough heat in the dovetail tenon that it sort of radiates out into the neck block. There's a lot of mass there to heat up, so it takes some time. Checking the outside of the heel here, we're above 40 degrees Celsius. It's more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's quite a distance from the end of the dovetail. I can also look at the inside here on the face of the neck block, and that's also up there near 100 Fahrenheit, 40 degrees Celsius. So I can't really apply pressure to the bottom of the heel at this time because the electrodes have a tendency to cross over between the dovetail tenon and embed themselves into the neck block, sort of crossing the boundary, so that if you put pressure on them, you're basically you're jamming the electrodes up against things, and could potentially either deform them or maybe even break them, I guess, I don't know. So I'm going to have to remove those before I start working this back and forth and getting some pressure. Well, I gotta say I'm stymied here. I've done 2 sessions of heat, got it as warm as I'm comfortable getting it, and there hasn't been even a millimeter of movement. So So I'll go into some different measures here. I'm going to fill up this pocket with vinegar, which works quite well on PVA style adhesives. Doesn't do anything. I'll go back and we'll have to get out the steamer. What I'm frightened of is perhaps someone maybe put a screw through this heel at some point and broke it off and got it into the neck block, or in some very rare instances Gibson has done some crazy stuff like putting the top over a dovetail. So, you know, I don't expect that's what's happened here, but it is a bit concerning that there is absolutely no movement. Yep, had to get out the espresso machine. Pumping in the steam here. The guitar is angled in such a way that the condensation will run out off the heel rather than into the body, where it can do a lot of damage. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. It took a second application of steam. This is so sticky. Wow. Jeez. That's the hardest one I've done. You can see why we don't like the steam. This blushing here, some of that's going to go away. Some of it will probably stay and I'll have to do a touch-up. But it was just shooting out from everywhere in there. Let's see. The shim that was in there. I'm still picking hockey tape off, trying to figure out what the best solution is for dealing with this binding. I spent some time yesterday picking portions of it away, and the problem is some parts are still very nicely adhered and other parts just crumble, but it takes an awful long time trying to get it off here while, you know, reserving the white, black, white purfling line that's on there as well. I think probably my best solution will be to route portions of it away, get rid of the bulk, and then, you know, scrape or chisel the remainder. The channel is a full 120 thousandths deep for most of its run, although portions are narrower, which is kind of disconcerting. I think up here in the upper bout is, you know, like 10 thousandths less. Let's see, I'm checking through my bearings here. I have a 90 thousandths, which would work, and 100 thousandths. I think I'll go with 100 thousandths and see what that does. I'm covering the bottom of my palm router here with some tape because I've learned from experience that the plastic here with various score marks on it can actually cause little scratches in the finish, which I'd like to avoid. I'm going to set the depth of cut a little bit shallow and test it at various places around the body because I want to leave a little lip of material here to be removed afterwards. I'm not going to do the whole thing. This binding ledge is deep enough as it is. I wouldn't want to make it any deeper. So this is not a quick and easy job. You know, it's not like you just peel off the old binding and stick a new piece on there. Getting the old stuff off is a real chore. And I'm going to get really dirty doing this too. Celluloid binding tends to stink when you cut it. It smells like Vicks Vapor Rub because it's got camphor, usually, as one of the plasticizers. Okay, people with some building experience are scratching their heads at the idea that I'm using a flat router base plate here on arched top and back plates. But remember, I'm not cutting to full depth or width. If I was, I'd obviously have to use a router that would account for that radius. So, stuff is flying off. Even though I scored around the binding, the vibration is kicking that old dry lacquer off at the edge, making it pretty ragged. And it's back to picking, chiseling, and scraping. Commercially available purfling strips are quite thin, only about a 1/16 of an inch or 1.5 millimeters, and I need these to go to the full 1/4 inch plus depth of the channel, like 6.5 millimeters. So I'm gluing up pieces of maple and dyed black veneer here. Yes, it does take a lot of glue, and it is kind of a messy operation. I press those together between a couple of pieces of melamine faced particle board and use a lot of clamps. The trick here is I actually clamp down both ends of the long steel rule on top of the veneer stack so it won't move while I'm doing this cut. Also, keep your fingers away from that scalpel blade. The stack of purfling ends up being about a 1/16 of an inch, 1.5 millimeters thick, which is just flexible enough to go around the curves of a dreadnought. Any thicker than that, I'd probably have to heat bend it. I'll check to see that I'm in the ballpark in terms of fit. There's always going to be inconsistencies, as the sides in the original binding would have been sanded together after installation, thinning it out in certain areas more than others. Here's another tip. I chamfer the inner corner that fits against the body. This helps in case it's out of square or there's debris that could hold it away from the sidewall. I'll use some super glue just at the very end to get it stuck down fast. The end of the purfling has been cut at an angle, and the other piece that will fit against it will be cut at the complementary angle for a scarf joint. The same thing goes for the binding. I'm going to knock off that inner corner. Then I'm going to rough up the gluing surface with 80 grit sandpaper because I'm going to use Titebond to glue it on. And that raises eyebrows every time. You're supposed to use acetone, man. And I agree. If you're building a guitar from scratch, sure, of course. But try that on a repair and find out for yourself what happens to the lacquer in the area around it. The 80 grit leaves scratches that are deep enough for the PVA to really grab hold. And I learned about this via Husson Dalton guitars. It's how they put their Ivoroid on, and I've seen the result 20 plus years later, no problems. You could use other adhesives, but Titebond works for both the wood purfling and the celluloid at the same time, so it's convenient, and that's what I use. So I get a generous layer of glue in there, and then I wipe off as much of the excess as I can with a slightly dampened paper towel. Then I'll tape it in place. And yeah, once again, painter's tape on a delicate old finish. There are ways. I use a hairdryer. It's not set on high, and I keep it moving. Common sense plays a role here. You don't want to get things too hot, but it does, if you're careful, release the adhesive enough that it's not going to cause damage, or it'll minimize the damage. Here's a shot for all those with misophonia. Yeah, better get used to it. Got to do this for about an hour. I'm scraping both the binding and the purfling that I installed, trying to bring it as level as I can with the rest of the surface. On the back here, there were certain areas that were too proud, so we'll take them down a bit with a chisel. Let's talk about this joint here. It's not really a dovetail. It's like a mortise and tenon trying to disguise itself as a dovetail by wearing an ill-fitting trench coat. Shims in the dovetail pocket are usually flat strips of veneer. They just take up space. They don't actually change the shape of the pocket. But in this case, they're triangular in section. They're wedges. So you pair that with a tenon that has had most of its angle cut off on the sides, and you can't really call it a dovetail anymore. In engineering terms, it isn't a sliding or a friction fit. This is an interference fit. It was likely that they carved it to the point where they could get it close and then literally hammered it home. So the wood fibers on the points here would crush together with what was in the pocket. And they added enough glue in there as well to make a soup and sort of fill in all the spaces. This is why I say neck resets on a Gibson are a completely different animal from Martin's. Some people charge more to do them, and they are justified because of these surprises. So I've got to now try to graft on some extra material here and make this work somehow.
I go in with a chisel and clean out the face of the heel and slightly undercut it, which will make fitting it to the body a little bit easier when it comes time to pull sandpaper through there. I use 100 grit sandpaper that's been backed with packing tape so that it's a little more robust and stands up to these pulling sessions a bit better. Pull about 5 on each side and then check and see what it's done to the angle. Go back and do it again and again. When I'm satisfied with the angle and it's time to glue it in, I just put glue on the sides of the tenon rather than on the face of the heel, or great big globs of it in the pocket. And this glues on with just one clamp. I'm leaving the fingerboard extension loose at this point because I'm going to be putting a wedge under there, which I'll plane out of a piece of rosewood. This one tapers from around 50 thousandths, 1.2 millimeters down to nothing. I sand it, show up the high spots, and scrape it. Sometimes I'll glue this on before putting the neck in place. Other times it seems to make more sense to do it after the fact. So I'll glue that in. It's sized so that there's a bit of fall away from the 14th fret down to the edge of the sound hole. It's not perfectly straight. There's usually going to be, about a drop of 0.5 millimeter, 32nd of an inch or something there. Now I can get on to routing out the saddle slot. I'll mark out its position. I'll set up my slotting jig. This is going to be just about 1/8 of an inch wide, in keeping with Gibson guitars of the past. Usually about an 1/8 inch saddle slot, which is nice. It gives you a bit more room for intonation. Now it's time to make and install the thin overlay to bolster the area around the pinholes. I hold it in position with some 1032 screws through the outside holes. Just keeps it in the right spot while I put the clamps on. I'll drill through that thin maple pad, backing it up with a block of wood on the inside for obvious reasons. I'll remount the pinholes, and I'll chamfer the surface around the hole.
I got to replace that 15th fret, and I think I'm going to do the first 3 as well, because these are damaged enough that I don't want to leave them like this. I'm going to do everything else, might as well do this as well. Check out this brace here. There are a number of brace crossings in here that have been re-glued. This one, however, has actually been glued open. It's solid and secure, but there's like a 1/16 of an inch worth of carpenter's glue in the center there, and I'm not sure what I'm gonna do. I've been thought about trying to saw through that glue line and clean out as much as I can and then try and press the brace back together. It seems like a very hit and miss idea. Plus the last guy tried it and obviously it wasn't successful then. It's glued solid to the other brace as well at the end, and if this doesn't work I might actually make things worse. Plus, I can't add another day of work on this job. It's not in the budget. So I've decided to sand the brace flat, and I'm going to glue on a supplemental covering that's going to go over it here that will bridge the gap and add some stiffness as well. This is nice quarter sawn brace stock. Just going to glue that in place.
I love these little dollar store spring clamps. They're the perfect size for so many jobs. You hear that vibrating pingy sound? That's what happens when you have a string running over a saddle that's too flat. It's what I mean when I talk about a sitar sound. So I use the B string here to map out the correct intonation points for each string. I'll mark them in pencil, and I can file them to suit. I'll use a couple of thin coats of amber shellac to take off some of the newness in the purfling and kind of bring it down to a more aged yellow look.
All right, I'm calling it. It's done. This was a lot of work, guys. I gotta tell you, that binding there, I've done 3 or 4 other similar jobs But in those, it just sort of came off with much less hassle. Just finger pressure, you could peel it off, and where it was stuck, I could get a chisel behind it and it would just sort of pop out like it was dry or desiccated or something. And it would leave behind a pretty clean channel. This guy here, not only was it far more secure, even in the rotten portions, the binding is so much wider and thicker than in the older guitars. And the channel it left behind was a lot more inconsistent. In other words, like, it wasn't the same width all the way around, so there was an awful lot of fitting to do. I'm never going to be perfectly satisfied with this because, up close you can see rub marks from the router bearing and places where the finish cracked away. So unless you're going to do a full-scale refinish job, it's never going to look perfect. I'm going to go out on a limb and say this was pushing it in terms of being worth it. I mean, it had to be done. The way it was before, you were in serious danger of slicing up your forearm, when you were strumming, because the rotten portions were so sharp and jagged, like little knives. It's difficult to anticipate some of this stuff. All little things that add up. Had that one loose brace, the weirdly cracked one on this side, several back cracks, a split around the sound hole, replacing those first 3 frets, and I made a plug for the hole left behind by the jack. I found an old Gibson strap button. The neck reset and the new bridge are kind of a no-brainer, but beyond that, where do you stop with a guitar like this? I mean, the frets on the rest of the board are kind of low for me. I don't like the tuning machines. They're very sharp on the fingers when you're turning them. And one of them is kind of bent. I could try and disguise the headstock brake a bit better. At which point the effort involved, sort of outpaces the market value of the thing. So I have to temper my desire to fix everything because it's not only not worth it, it's just impossible at a certain point. But, the action is now about 20% lower, and the guitar's voice is it's much improved. Having enough bridge and saddle height is very important the way these things sound, especially a Dreadnought. Some of the smaller body guitars with less soundboard area, you can get by with a lower bridge, but you do need a certain amount of height to make these things sound the way they're supposed to sound.